Hello, where we are listeners. If you're a longtime fan of this podcast or you're just joining us for the first time today, we want to tell you more about our podcast platform called Spotify for Podcasters. We've been using this platform for over a year, and it's been easy to use, and new features are added all the time. You can record and edit podcasts from your phone or computer. You don't need anything fancy, and you don't need previous podcast experience. When you hit publish, you will distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify if that's your kind of thing. And with Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. But here's the thing, you can earn money, but it's a free platform. There's no catch. If you're curious or want to see what it's all about, download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
Hey dear, what do you have to drink?
I would like for you to make me an aviation.
An aviation? Fancy, complicated. We could do it. I'm going to do a Saranac Shirley Temple, baby. You're listening to Where's the Love? I am Michael Ware.
I'm Melissa Ware.
And good to be with you. As always, Melissa, we had such a good time talking with Tyler in last week's episode. Hope you'll go back and listen to that episode if you haven't yet. It's a good one. Always love talking with Pastor Tyler Wigg Stevenson. But it's just us tonight. Yep. As usual, there may be noise throughout the podcast because there's a winter storm outside and wind at like 50 miles per hour, and our house has a lot of windows, and we have like tornado style noise in the house right now.
Yes, so if it sounds like Wizard of Oz up in this podcast, there's a reason why.
Yes, but we'll power through, and we are going to get back this episode talking through top 5.
Yes.
I think before we get to that, some good content this week over at reclaiminghope.substack.com, which, by the way, Substack this week announced a app. So you can get the app and have like a little, like a reader, all the Substack sort of folks you follow. If you just follow us, then that's fine. We encourage, but you'll have all of the latest posts on the app. And I think that's a pretty cool feature. And if you were following the Substack this week, I shared something of an unusual, although I think we're trying to make it more usual on the Substack, which is to also be sharing a bit about family and parenthood and those kinds of things. And I shared a post about cooking for your family with little time while still trying to cook with love, and shared some tips for doing that, and hope to share more in the weeks ahead. But it was so great to get reader feedback on that. A lot of you already roasting chickens is a good shortcut to satisfaction, and so that's fun, and would love for you all to send me your favorite recipes for especially cooking during the work week, and so was glad to do that. And then posted an essay later in the week about I think a missing part of the conversation around so many of the sort of hot button issues lately, and that is that just because you can marshal the support to do something through government, and just because it passes constitutional muster, doesn't necessarily mean that it's the wisest way to proceed. the essay delves into that a bit, talk about COVID politics, talk about a range of issues, and try to open up some space where we can talk about the difference between what we might personally like to see, even what we consider to be sort of the ideal society, the ideal way things would function, and what you do through the coercive and public power of the government. And so you can read that by going to reclaiminghope.substack.com. And then, of course, Melissa, we had all the content that we usually have. Top 5, we had political brief, and we had faith in the news. Anything you want to comment on?
No comments. we can get right to it.
Let's get to it. Yeah, what are we talking about this week?
We are talking about 2 top 5 articles this week, and the first we wanted to discuss is from George Packer in The Atlantic. It's called "The Grown-Ups Are Losing It," and in the subtitle, "We've turned schools into battlefields and our kids are the casualties." And I chose this article to be in the top 5 because, we've talked about the school debate issue, especially around COVID, Democrats trying to, recover some of the ground that they've lost because of these issues, the parents' rights debates. And George Packer has basically decided, I'm going to write something that cuts to the heart of what is school actually for. And then at the end of the article, he proposes a few of the areas in which we need to really focus in on to try to get back to this idea of what is school actually for. And schools, and he takes a quote from this scholar at AEI called Robert Pundisi, who says that we should be in the habit of thinking about education as citizen making. So we should be making citizens through our public education system. And Packer goes on and says, school can't just be an economic sorting system. One reason we have a stake in the education of other people's children is that they will grow up to be citizens. Education is a public interest, which explains why parents shouldn't get to veto any book they think might upset their child, whether it's To Kill a Mockingbird or Beloved. Public education is meant not to mirror the unexamined values of a particular family or community, but to expose children to ways that other people, some of them long dead, think. In an authoritarian or rigidly meritocratic system, schools select the elites who grow up to make the decisions. A functioning democracy needs citizens who know how to make decisions together. And so I think that that's actually like a really good summary as to what is school for. And then the part that I found the most interesting in this article is some of the sort of areas in which we should focus on to try to, I think, sort of patch together the problems that we have in the public education system right now. And I'm just going to quote the article again before I get into it. The goal isn't just to teach students the origins of the Civil War, but to give them the ability to read closely, think critically, evaluate sources, corroborate accounts, and back up their claims with evidence from original documents. This kind of instruction, which requires teachers to distinguish between exposure and indoctrination, isn't easy. It asks them to be more sophisticated professionals than their shabby conditions and pay. Parenthetical median salary, $62,000, less than accountants and transit police. Suggests we are willing to support. We have a desperate shortage of teachers, David Steiner of Johns Hopkins said, just as we're making teaching more difficult by politicizing education. It's easy and satisfying for adults to instruct children that America is an exceptional experiment in freedom or a benighted system of oppressions. It's harder but infinitely more useful to free them to think about history for themselves. This part on history, I mean, we've been talking about what is history, how do you teach history, what's included, what's excluded for, a good several years now. And it's something that I've thought about a lot as well, especially the problem that Packer's presenting here, teachers and the curricula that they're given and the time and the resources that they're given, and the fact that if you want to teach history that's more grounded in shared experiences rather than just event to event, it takes a lot of training. It takes a lot of time and the ability to actually receive training, and training is expensive and things like that. But it brought back this. I worked on this shared history program about 6 or 7 years ago that was incredible. It was about world history teaching. It was about creating a pedagogy and teacher training modules that would lead to greater critical thinking and analytical skills for students from ages 7 to 10 years old. So very, very young. So we're not talking about high schoolers here. So starting off with those types of skills, which is very much a problem we have right now, where kids are just sort of presented facts, you memorize them, you take a test, and then you move on. You don't really have a building of critical or analytical skills until basically if you choose to go to college.
Yeah, so I did think that was interesting. I was reflecting though, Melissa. So much of what is said about sort of the state of public education, the state of like what's being taught, and even as I read people's stories of what they didn't learn about in high school and are just learning now, sort of those kinds of things, there's been a spate of I guess like historical books on race, gender that are hailed as like these eye-opening works that like why did no one ever tell me this? And I've read them and found them generally to be valuable to a certain extent. I was really surprised to find entire chapters in some of these books about like books I read in high school in like freshman year. And we've talked about this on we didn't go to like a top level public high school. I mean
literally nowhere near it.
Right.
Yeah.
I was very grateful for my public education and high school, but just sort of we were not in the wealthiest school districts, and we were not in a particularly like highfalutin area. I think the New York State system is generally thought to be, in terms of curriculum and standards, like better than other states. But we didn't go to like an elite high school, and so that's striking to me. That Packer, like it's hard for me to gauge how pervasive the kind of things Packer is talking about, and that so many other people talk about on both the right and the left in our curriculums, or is this like fever dream stuff? Like is Packer in a way sort of projecting his sort of cultural preferences onto public schools? So he talks about sort of literature and the fact that like the testing is around these isolated, paragraphs of literature and not sort of analysis and delving deep into books. But like we were just in school 15 years ago, I fell in love with so many books in high school, like great works of literature that I felt like Mrs. Grabenstatter, really opened up and let us explore. And then, when like the state test time came around, it was, read these random 3 paragraphs from, whatever. And it was like reading weird reading comprehension stuff that sometimes seemed really far removed from reality or how you should read. So I resonated with Packer saying that. But so I just I'm not sure how pervasive some of this stuff is. So much of it doesn't resonate with sort of my education. And then the broader sort of point I wanted to make was, Packer is such a thoroughgoing liberal. And I think he is, he talks about, the purpose of public education to like, get people out of their isolated, tribes and their families and expose them to sort of democratic education so that they could learn about the broader world. And like there's all kinds of historic like subtext for that kind of language and what that means. Historically, that has meant things like dissuade people from their silly religious superstitions, or dissuade students from the habits of their ethnic background. I have an article that we've talked about coming out about how this was done in New York City public schools with Italian immigrants, that the school system was used to sort of suggest that an Italian sort of Italian lifestyle was unhealthy and sort of backwards looking. And of course, that same playbook has been there's all these kinds of assumptions about it. What Packer doesn't seem to be doing is saying public schools should not be influencing kids. And of course, the idea that that's sort of the liberal bubble that needs to be pierced here, that Packer seems to want to pierce in some ways, and in other ways he doesn't. We were talking before recording, sometimes I read Packer, and especially lately, and go, these are a lot of words for him just to get around to saying he's uncomfortable with the current state of racial discourse in this country and regarding education. And so it seems like we've hit a soft spot for Packer on the direction of the conversation, and maybe that's legitimate, and maybe it should be a soft spot. But I was reading this and just thinking, there are deeper questions to be asked here about the purpose of education and exactly how intrusive, how redirective a public education should be, and Packer in some ways asks those questions. In other ways, he seems like upset that other people are asking those questions and the answers aren't turning out to his liking. So, I'm not sure. To me, I read this article and thought, well, yeah, this is the liberal dilemma that we're going through. And Packer is basically saying, can we please go back to when there was a consensus that a basically progressive liberal but sort of not self-consciously identitarian sort of ideological hegemony was in place. Things are too fractured now for me, and I don't know if we're going back. I think this is just part of the landscape. Now, I guess the last thing I'd say, which is, and I tweeted this earlier this week, which is Liz Brunig really helped me understand the way in which schools often become the sort of vector for these debates, because it's one of the rare ways in which our highly symbolic cultural politics can at least be given the semblance of real import. It's schools operate, and this is what Packer kind of touches on too, which is our schools are operating as a sort of playground for adults' issues, and that's a real problem. And but again, I don't know the way out. It's not like kids are going to be deciding their own curriculum. Like adults have to run things. Just adults have to be better.
For me, one of the reasons why I chose this article for Top 5 is that Packer does delve just slightly, a little bit. So something I would love much more discussion on, other people writing essays, whatever, is on this issue of how versus what. So a lot of our arguments and the strife that we have around schools right now is on the what of curriculum, whereas I think that where we should be focusing and where Packer is focusing a bit on is the how, the pedagogy. How are we actually teaching children different subject matters? And the how is in giving children critical thinking skills, analytical skills, where no matter what kind of information that they're presented with, they're able to work through that information and think for themselves and come to conclusions, dive in further on something, even at a young age. I mean, there's curriculum out there where you can be teaching these types of skills even in kindergarten, first grade, like 7-year-olds. You can build the foundations for these things. And so I would love to see a lot more discussion if we're going to try to go a bit above the culture war fray here, which I think Packer is trying to do. But the points you're bringing up is that even if he's trying to go above the fray, he's still caught up in it quite a bit. Is I would love to see some thinkers out there trying to go above the fray here and start talking about the how. How can we be delivering better pedagogy to teachers, and how are we supporting teachers to even have the ability to access better pedagogy? Because like Packer says, they're paid way too little and don't have enough time to be learning how to be teaching things differently, especially when they have standards to meet and other things sort of taking away from their time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's helpful. I do think right, like this is liberalism, like that, like this is it's the it's the idea that we could, if we just set up like the right process, then we could avoid making sort of determinations on what's actually right, like that. And so I'm not sure how much of this we can. I'm not sure how much of this we can ally. Like, so I have to think that Packer would draw some lines in terms of what would be appropriate in a curriculum. That he's not just saying like let's throw at students everything, and as long as they have like the right analytical skills, like they could wade through the muck, like there's some boundaries. And I think like what so much of the current discourse is about is like, okay, so if we're going to acknowledge that there are some boundaries, that some material is worth discussion and some is not, then who's deciding what's worth discussion and what is not? And I tend to be on like, I think either way you work that out, it's not just a process question. People are actually moving their ideological aims through some of these process questions, and it seems like a tough quandary. It seems like to me, Melissa, like this is like when you have a polarized people, then these questions of sharing a common process, or in the field of education, like a common pedagogy, becomes more and more difficult because there's not sort of the shared. There's more societal distrust, so there's just less grace, less of a sense of solidarity, and so fights just break out. I think it's really tough. I don't think I do encourage folks to read the article. I don't think Packer has solved it here. One other thing he does touch on, though, is the tech side, and I thought, it was in some ways interesting. I was a little surprised it's just sort of a couple paragraphs. I do think it's a piece of all of this, and I am interested in sort of the connection between the types of habits our technology promotes, particularly for young people, and the way that intersects with the way they receive and interact with their education. And I think that's obviously a part of this puzzle as well.
For me, in a polarized age, I'm still going to go along the pedagogy route because, yes, I'm not trying to be naive here, thinking that ideology is, pedagogy is free from ideology. What I'm talking about is we have to go after the lowest hanging fruit or the lowest common denominator, the thing that we'll be able to more easily get done, potentially get more agreement on. Obviously, like the boundary thing, yes, but I'm not talking about a technocratic solution here. I'm talking about the lowest hanging fruit solution here, where you can create boundaries around pedagogy. And yes, that's where the sort of fights will be. But the whole, the subject matters, the what of whatever it is, whatever the subject is, that's the stuff that is making, causing people to just, whatever the title of this article is, just sort of lose their minds. So, I just wanted to defend that approach a little bit here. Because where else are you going to start in a polarized society? You're just going to end up nowhere if you just keep on discussing it over and over again.
No. I mean, yeah, that's why I call it a quandary, right? Like,
I know that. Yeah.
It's because when when the common denominator keeps lowering, then everything gets tougher in terms of self-governance, generally. And so, it's an interesting entry in sort of this ongoing conversation. The article is "The Grown-Ups Are Losing It," and it's George Packer for The Atlantic. Melissa, we had one other article we wanted to discuss. Again, this will be in the top 5. Tee this up for us.
This article is an interview between one of our favorite writers, Vincent Cunningham, and Cornel West, and it's in the New Yorker. The title of the article is "Cornel West Sees a Spiritual Decay in the Culture." Subtitle: A Conversation with a Prominent Philosopher About Democracy, Disagreement, and How to Stay Upright in a Fallen World. And this is just a super enjoyable interview. Vincent is particularly gifted at interviews like this. But
Vincent could just follow Cornel wherever he was going.
Yes, which
and
is just
so
such a
often,
gift.
yes, yeah, they're really good.
Yes, they really. Vincent points out something key about Cornel in that Cornel often starts with the individual, if he whomever it is that he's talking to. So Cornel starts off by asking about Vincent's family, and Vincent points out that Cornel does this a lot to sort of create a familiarity, a camaraderie during a conversation, which is just so true because I don't know, 3/4 of the way through the interview, Cornel talks about the different debates that he's had with people whom he vehemently disagrees with, but also is able to treat with an immense amount of dignity each time. And I think that there's a through line there about Cornel and about this interview. So, I mean, where does it even start? Because they cover a lot of ground in this interview.
Yeah, so let me jump in with what I thought was most interesting, which is Vincent asks Dr. West. Wes is now back at Union Theological Seminary, and Vincent asks Wes, does it feel different being in a specifically religious environment as opposed to Harvard, a secular space? Does that change the way you approach not only your teaching but your public presentation? And Wes says that at Union, though it's not, the students are religiously diverse, but because it's a seminary and sort of these questions of vocation, these questions of meaning are more sort of at the surface. That there is this sense of vocation, whereas at Harvard, Wes says, quote, you have a site of formation of professional managers that are tied to profession, but not so much vocation. They're tied to career, not as much to calling. Wes goes on to say, my sense of vocation and my sense of calling is the same no matter where and what I'm doing. But at Union, because it's taken for granted, I'm able to be much more forthright. And he means I'm able to sort of bring all of my sort of metaphysical, religious commitments, my sense of vocation and calling directly to bear. So I thought that was, I thought that was so interesting. It's important, like he doesn't say he's necessarily he favors one environment over the other, just that there are different ways to operate in each. I've certainly found that in my life. I thought it was really interesting for him to have that insight. He goes on in the next question to say something else that's super interesting.
That was one of my favorite parts.
Yeah. Dive into it.
So the question is, do seminary students in your observation these days feel cowed or more embattled? They're entering a world that might be less receptive to the fruits of their training. And Wes starts off with how he began teaching at Union in 1977. And he says that at the time, the secular was much more elevated or prominent. And then he says, since then, since 1977, the secular has taken on a lot of wounds and bruises because of commodification. And he says, so when you think of the secular, you don't think right away of scientific authority, scientific breakthroughs. When you think of the secular these days, you think of careerism, opportunism, hedonism, egoism, individualism, and the ways in which science seems to be driven by corporate greed seems to be moving towards the explosion of the planet or the collapse of the environment. So that the secular has a very different resonance now than it did in 77. It's almost as if everybody recognizes the spiritual decay and the moral decrepitude of the culture.
Wow.
So this is so interesting.
Wow.
Because I think we mentioned a couple episodes ago, Christopher Lasch, and we've been reading a lot of Lasch. And the way he describes the secular at that time, because most of Lasch's books were written in the 70s and the problems of the 70s and how they very much look like today, I can see Wes and Lasch sort of, I don't know, vibing here together a little bit. And
well, I mean, Lasch. I perked up right when he said the professional managerial class, which is Lasch spends a lot of time on that, particularly in Revolt of the Elites, but also in Culture of Narcissism. Yeah, no, I think this answer was worth the price of admission to the interview. This idea that it's actually, there's such a narrative now that we have a so I think there are some who still hold on to the idea, as long as they don't think about it too much, that we're sort of on a progressively secular trajectory. But I agree with Wes. I think that is actually breaking down. And what he proposes here, which is actually, and I want Christians to hear this, right? It's actually a secular, materialist worldview that is feeling pressure and that is cracking under the weight of reality of the last 30, 50 years. I think so often Christians can imbibe this sort of speaking of Lasch, the sense of nostalgia about the past and this sense of actually taking on a narrow and parochial view of what progress looks like, so that we almost sort of call Christianity in for defeat regardless of the circumstances
Yes.
and regardless of what's happening on around us. And what's interesting, I mean, Wes is a Christian, he's a believer, but I think a lot of people would look at Wes and go, oh, he's a progressive, like a Bernie guy. What's interesting here is that Wes seems much more optimistic and has a much broader view of the play that Christianity can have in this cultural moment than many of the most conservative Christian worldview people would have. Wes is actually saying, no, it's like things are contested now and open in ways that they weren't in 1977. Find someone on the religious right who would say that the culture is more open to Christianity now than it was before the religious right, before the rise of the Christian coalition and the moral majority. I mean, so it's just an incredibly provocative answer he gives here that actually, I think if you hold it up to reality, I think it matches. Now, he goes on in the answer to say, and then the question becomes, well, what blame do we give to religious institutions for accommodating to the empire, for accommodating to the sort of commodification that we've seen? And certainly that's a question. So, Wes is not saying secularism has been proven to be inadequate and,
that it's
religion,
the most atrophied thing.
like religion is like here to win the day. No, he's saying what Charles Taylor and so many others have said, what I've written about, which is, no, this is a time when sort of every worldview, every sort of unified theory is under attack and critiqued and being deconstructed. And so the question is, what gets constructed in the midst of all of this destruction?
And then he goes on the very next question of Vincent very astutely asked, connecting this with the common refrain or rhetoric being used right now, which is believe in science.
Oh, don't get me started.
I know. And I literally bring this up right now, Michael, because you've been railing against the term believe in science for years now. And Wes just kind of just ethers it by reminding people that science in the past has decided some incredibly awful, immoral things about certain types of people, and has said scientific conclusions when there were none there. Right.
But he has this amazing line that I will be citing him for. He finishes by saying, so his point is, folks tied to religious traditions need to hold on to the best of the Enlightenment of various sorts, because he says there's something really critical there. He says, quote, there's always a strong leaven in any Enlightenment. And then he goes on to say, as you said, he talks about all the ways science has been misused in ways that I think people too casually shrug off as, oh, well, that wasn't real science. It's so funny how the same kinds of excuses people give to excuse away wrongs of religion, how quickly people who are advocates for science will take up the very same kind of justifications they disdain and that they'd shred if they were made on the religious side. But Wes closes here by saying the best of science can be Socratic, which is such an interesting idea. I think what it does is it takes science off the throne a bit. It also, I think, is a much more hopeful and a much more accurate sort of depiction of how science actually functions in the world and what the best of science could be. I thought it was such a fascinating interview, and And I hope a lot of folks from all kinds of different perspectives read it. He says quite a few things here I disagree with pretty robustly, but I'm always happy when I read West, especially when he's being interviewed by someone like Vincent.
Mm-hmm. No, it was a great interview. And I also, he pushes this point home a lot in a lot of the different speeches or interviews that he does. But Vincent gets into, support of Obama or support of Biden, and West sort of, along with a lot of like what you've written throughout the years in terms of supporting where you can and disagreeing where you don't actually support whomever it is that you're voting for. And I just think that's so important for people to hear again and again and again, especially from someone like him, from what Vincent gets into a little bit in the article as well, a public philosopher. Yeah. No, it's good stuff. And there was some news. So, I guess on Vincent's side, it's been previously announced, but Vincent's working on a book on R&B, and then he's working on a novel about a campaign staffer who goes through a campaign and goes through a presidential campaign and how it leads him to reconsider and think about his religious life and perspective. And I think obviously that's going to be fascinating. Vincent was so kind when Reclaiming Hope came out, and Vincent himself interacted with the Obama, did work with the Obama campaign as well. I'm really excited to see what a novel sort of along these lines looks like. And then he's writing a book on R&B, which I'm really excited about too. So much good stuff coming out from Vincent. But then the news that I hadn't heard is that Dr. West has been offered, invited, and has accepted to be giving the Giffords Lectures in 2 years. So this year, Oliver O'Donovan gave the Giffords Lectures. They're some of the most prestigious sort of philosophical lectures. And so that's something to put on the calendar. And he even says in the article, West has never taught in a philosophy department. He's a philosopher by training, and he goes into a bit more. I won't sort of recap all of his reasoning for that. But the Giffords Lectures, he says, are his opportunity to sort of lay out his philosophical vision, which in some ways he hasn't done before. So it should be a really interesting. It should be something to put on the calendar. So I thought that was again, maybe I missed him announcing it somewhere else, but I thought it was an interesting little news tidbit in this interview. I think that wraps it up for today.
I think that wraps it up. It's been good to be with you. Hope you'll read the top 5. Let us know what you think. Let us know what you think of these 2 articles and the rest of the content that you've received through Reclaiming Hope this past week. Again, you could subscribe at reclaiminghope.substack.com. Get this podcast, get our content in your inbox automatically, and leave a review on iTunes or on any of the podcast providers if you wouldn't mind. Helps us out. And tell your friends about Where Is the Love. All right, babe. It's another episode in the can.
I thought you were about to say another one bites the dust.
I should have said another one bites the dust. I don't think I own that song, or else we'd close with that. But
that would actually be pretty good.
Yeah. But instead, we'll close with Where Is the Love? And
Roberta Flack, man.
And we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.